Much later.
This video is brought to you by Dashlane. Stay secure online and never forget a password again. More on that later. In 1904, the Russo-Japanese War took place, and it would eventually encompass one of the worst mimetic naval disasters in history, and we'll get to that. But there's a lot of other interesting things that happen in this war that are often glossed over. First, the setup, but I'll be brief because it's fairly complicated and not what the video's about. But basically, China fell apart again because it tends to do that, and a lot of countries ran to make claims once this happened. After this, Japan attempted to make various claims in Korea and elsewhere that were shouted down by the European powers because apparently only Europeans are allowed to colonize. There's a bit more to this, but I'm going to go ahead and move on because the next thing is the only real important part. And that being that the Russians saw this as a golden opportunity to expand their territory, and had worked out a deal to where they now controlled the port of Port Arthur, and were constructing a railroad connecting it to the Trans-Siberian Railway, stationing a lot of troops in Manchuria to protect it. Now, Port Arthur was extremely important to the Russians because it was a warm water port, and warm water ports are like crack to them. The Japanese were upset about this though because it hindered their territorial expansion, especially into Korea, which they really wanted to annex. And it's at this point that the stage is set. In February of 1904, after months of fruitless negotiations, mostly over Korea, the Japanese fleet attacked the Russian Pacific Fleet in Port Arthur. This especially aggravated the Russians because on top of having their fleet destroyed, the Japanese declaration of war got to the Russian government after the attack had begun, which the Russians saw as unfair and underhanded. But given that a very similar sequence of events would unfold at Pearl Harbor, this would later become a theme for the Japanese. Now, we'll get back to the naval war in a minute, but first let's talk about the land war, which is often ignored. There were two sorts of fronts between the Russians and Japanese fighting in Manchuria. The first was the besieging and the eventual taking of Port Arthur by General Nogi Marisuke. The combat around Port Arthur and what led up to its taking was extremely reminiscent of what eventually would be seen as the Western Front in World War I, with the Japanese digging complicated trenches toward Russian emplacements around the city. Although victorious, General Marisuke was not happy with the victory, extremely disappointed in himself for how many men he'd lost in the grinding attritional front, even requesting to commit suicide from the Emperor afterwards as he felt he had been dishonorable in his conduct. Slight tangent about Marisuke, he's an extremely interesting character all on his own. He was born 4 years before the opening of Japan into a very traditional samurai family, and grew up during Japan's rapid industrialization period. He became this mix of a very grandfatherly, caring figure for his men and a hardened traditional Bushido warrior. After the war, he had some political appointments and was a mentor to the future Emperor Hirohito, and kept with his traditional beliefs to the very end, committing suicide along with his wife when Emperor Meiji died in 1912 in classic samurai fashion. As far as the Russians go here, although General Stossel probably could not have won and beaten off the Japanese, there's a consensus that he probably could have held out longer, but got cold feet towards the end. And this is the theme you'll see repeated a few times in the Russian land forces. The war in the north was more a war of movement, with the different armies maneuvering around each other. The Russians in this sector, though, plagued by poor intelligence and frankly just nervous command, were never able to take advantage of superior numbers and crush the Japanese, even though they would have totally been able to. Japanese commanders in this sector often attacked extremely recklessly, holding no troops back as reserves. And instead of capitalizing on this, the Russians, having no idea how many Japanese there actually were, figured that these tactics were the result of Japanese confidence of other sources, most likely more troops or other maneuvers that they were not aware of. So the Russians were always kind of on their back foot when they moved throughout the war. Russian effectiveness was also cut short by a sort of compartmentalization of their forces, where you would see one group of Russian soldiers getting kicked around by the Japanese force, and the group next to them not responding or helping in any way because they would be either preoccupied with a less dangerous threat in front of them, or just waiting for orders and not taking any initiative. The Russians did fight well enough, however, that the Japanese were never able to produce a decisive victory over the war on the land. And with the recklessness on the Japanese part, it's kind of hard to determine who really fought better. And now we'll get back to the naval war. After the destruction of the Pacific Fleet, Tsar Nicholas approved a daring plan to sail the Russian Baltic Fleet to Japan to go win the war. And the whole operation was riddled with problems. A lot of the Baltic fleet was extremely inexperienced due to the fact that a lot of the sailors did not come from coastal regions, and they were iced in for a lot of the year, unable to get hands-on training. When leaving the docks for the first time, one ship lost its anchor, and while it was being retrieved, a destroyer accidentally rammed another ship, causing it to have to return for repairs. On the approach to the Denmark Strait, some of the ships became convinced that they had spotted Japanese torpedo boats, and fired on 2 fishermen delivering a dispatch to the admiral whose name is hard to pronounce. Some of the ships also thought they were going through a Japanese minefield for some reason. After sailing into the North Sea, they fired on a British fishing fleet thinking that they were Japanese torpedo boats, sinking one and damaging 2 of their own cruisers in the process. This caused 28 British battleships to shadow the Russian fleet until it sailed past Portugal. It also caused the British to shut the Suez Canal to the Russian fleet, making it so that they had to sail around Africa. Upon reaching Africa, the fleet lost contact with one ship that, when alone, fired 300 shells on European merchant ships as they thought they were Japanese. The Russian crews, with poor morale, attempted to lift their spirits by buying exotic pets on shore visits. One of these being a poisonous snake that got free on one battleship and bit the commanding officer. This was one of many animals that were roaming freely on the decks of the Russian ships. In Madagascar, Admiral Hard to Pronounce became ill with his chief of staff leaving no one in command of the fleet, and the crew spending lots of days on shore, where they picked up lots of disease with many men dying. At one of the funerals for deceased crewmen, a gun salute was arranged with live shells that caused another friendly fire incident. Around this time, mental illness for being at sea for so long began to affect the crew, and a large wave of religious fervor broke out, with one case of mutiny where the sailors involved had to be sent back home. At some point around here, one of the officers bought around 2,000 cigarettes from the shore, which ended up being filled with opium. After recovering, Admiral Consonant Shitshow ordered gunnery practice, but none of his destroyers scored any hits on the target. This included one jammed torpedo that swung off target, causing their ships to scatter in panic. Despite all these setbacks, though, the Russian fleet did eventually make it to Japan. There are even more incidents on this voyage I cut out for the sake of time, but you can read more about them in the link below. Now, for all of their hardships on their harrowing journey, the Russian fleet met a very unfairy tale-like ending, being all but completely destroyed by the Japanese fleet when engaged, leaving only 2 ships remaining. This defeat, along with the loss of Port Arthur, had made this war extremely unpopular in Russia, and had caused revolutionary activity back home, bringing the Tsar to the negotiation table and ending the war. The terms were very favorable to Japan as they laid the groundwork to annex Korea and gave them confidence in their ability to fight Western powers, but the Japanese populace did not feel that the war gains were worth the cost, a sentiment that had to be repressed by the Japanese government. But this war does have some very interesting insights and foreboding impacts. Firstly, with Russia, it shows the disdain for the Tsar's rule that is cropping up already before World War I, and that would later lead to his downfall, giving more context for the eventual revolution. For Japan, they would become the first Eastern power to defeat a Western power, and would in the process become an Eastern colonial power, something that they would continue to nurture in the following years, eventually resulting in the Second World War in the Pacific, beginning by taking lands that they wanted back then, eventually being free to do so years later, with the groundwork laid by kicking out the Russians in 1905. The embarrassing defeat at the hands of the Japanese was something that I'm sure the Tsar did not want to get out back home. It did, however, resulting in some very bad PR. Although a lot has changed since then, the need for privacy with need-to-know personal information has not. Being someone who uses the internet for almost everything in life, it feels good to have that extra level of security that Dashlane provides. Dashlane can be your one-stop shop for your digital identity by managing all your passwords so you don't have to keep track of each one, as well as personal info and financials, making your digital life safe and more secure. Dashlane also has a feature to save credit card info to save time when shopping online. It works across all devices including Android, iOS, Windows, and Mac. It also has some really great bonuses. A VPN to prevent prying eyes from tracking what you do and download online, so after you've downloaded a bunch of footage of Germany during World War II, you don't have to spend time explaining it to somebody that isn't going to believe it was just for an educational video, and dark web monitoring, to see if your information is being bought and sold illegally. To give it a try for free, go to dashlane.com/potentialhistory and use my promo code potentialhistory to get 10% off if you want to upgrade to premium. Thank you to all my patrons for making these videos possible. This video topic was actually decided on by a patron poll at the $5 and higher tier, of whose names you'll see on the screen. So feel free to check that out if you want to be involved in the next one. I plan to do them about every other month. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.